Welcome to the fall of 2020, when under normal times we would be in Faculty House having a lovely lunch together and listening to this epic conversation. But we should thank goodness that we have Zoom and that we have the ability to see one another even in our little pixelated boxes. And to be able to join in interesting and sometimes joyous occasions. I am just going to take 1 minute to tell you about what we have planned for the fall, and to hope that you will join in as much as you can. Deanna Dimitru, our administrator, is recording things, so if you can't come, many of the things that you will miss will be on our YouTube channel or on our website. For your information, in the upper, but you probably know this, you've probably all been zooming around all the time, in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, you can choose whether you can see everybody as a gallery, which will look like a whole bunch of little boxes in which you can choose to see people in consecutive screens, or you can go to speaker view, which will zero in on the speaker. And so that's your own choice. Once we get started, Deanna's going to mute everyone, and people will be unmuted for the questions and answers. We have a tremendously exciting fall season scheduled. Simon Schama is going to be our speaker in November. We're gonna get our own private viewing of and discussion of his new series that he's doing for the BBC on romantics. Jim Shapiro is going to come and give us a talk on his new book, Shakespeare in a Divided America. And as we did in person, we raffled off door prizes for people to get yet another book for their libraries. Deanna's found an app that lets us do an online raffle. So we'll have Zoom prizes, and you'll get 5 people will get a book, and we'll get signed book plates to put into them. So that's your enticement. We've expanded our graduate student series that Dan Tice runs to have more graduate students and to increase their honorarium, because it is such a difficult time for graduate students now. So we're working on finalizing that series. Ginny continues to run her wonderful yoga classes, assisted by Lala, who manages it, and Deanna has gotten, they've worked out really good filming as well, so we actually have a way that you can go in and do the yoga, either chair or mat yoga, through recordings as well. And we don't want to give up on our cocktail hours, so we have irregularly scheduled times when we just get together and have informal conversations, and there'll be one next Wednesday, and I'm hoping that you'll be there. They're really nice. Drinking is not required, but it is recommended, and they've been a wonderful thing to do over the summer. So with no further, I don't want to take up any more time. I'm going to turn this over to Volker Berghahn, has curated our Epic Conversations series over the past several years, and he'll take this program from here. Volker?
Well, thank you very much, Jeanne, and also a very warm welcome to all of you. These conversations are now, I think, quite well established. You may remember the last one we had with Ruth Fischbach and Jeanne, actually, in a conversation about another very important contemporary topic. Today's conversation was originally, as you may remember, scheduled for the 24th of March, but then this wretched virus intervened and we had to cancel this. Yet the subject that we had chosen seems so important to us that we should try to do this on Zoom, and I'm delighted that so many of you have joined into this subsequent discussion also. But above all, we had persuaded Roger to talk to us about this extraordinary work that he had done over many, many years. And in fact, if I may just introduce him very briefly to those of you who don't know him, after receiving his BA and an MPhil from Columbia, he actually completed his PhD at Harvard University, but ultimately came back to Columbia and was the Dean of the Columbia College, Dean of Students at Columbia for no less than 19 years before he retired about 10 years ago. But he remained very much involved in the university. For example, he taught a seminar titled Equity in Higher Education. And most importantly, however, I think it is the time that he directed the Upward Bound program, a major program for low-income students from New York City, rural Pennsylvania, and central Florida to obtain a college education, and also, very important still, the financial backup for this education. So there is a lot of history, I think, in today's conversation, and the insights that I hope Roger is going to give us into his work over many years. However, due to COVID, of course, we are also in the middle of a major crisis in higher education in this country right now, or all over the world. And I therefore hope that we will also have a more contemporary aspect to our conversation and get onto some problems of the present predicament in which we find ourselves. Now, Roger's partner is Fran Pritchett, well known to most of you. She is now Professor Emerita in Middle Eastern and South Asian Studies, receiving her MA from Berkeley and her PhD from the University of Chicago before coming to Columbia in 1982. She is an internationally acclaimed expert on Urdu poetry and or the Urdu literary tradition. However, while she was interested always in very faraway cultures, at the same time she has kept in touch with higher education in this country, and has worked with Roger for many, many years. In fact, already when she was in college, she began to connect with his program and has volunteered in his program to this day. So I think we are very fortunate to have two colleagues with us today who have been working together for many years and who will no doubt have a most interesting conversation for about 30 or 40 minutes. And then I hope there will be a lively question and answer period on these very topical subjects that they will be talking about. However, in the past, as Jeanne just said, we always had this over lunch and with a glass of wine. We cannot have this today. So nevertheless, I would like to take my glass and take this opportunity to, first of all, wish you good health, and so that we can soon get together in person to have our traditional lunches and glasses of wine. So to your health, and keep well and be well protected. I can now have this, I suppose, without impunity. So.
Okay, is it my turn?
Yep.
Oh, okay.
Yes, go ahead, Fran.
I guess this, if everybody else is muted, that must mean that I'm supposed to talk. I must just correct one thing that Volker said, because I would never claim the credit of having worked for many years with Roger. Volker has mentioned his very interesting Columbia College career. And in fact, we could enjoyably spend time asking him what it was like to be Dean of Students at Columbia College for those 20 crucial years. But in fact, we're going to treat that as a sort of backdrop. And we're going to dig deeper and see before that what happened at the very beginning of his career. And Roger insisted that I should mention the beginning of my own interest in these matters. And I did have, he's going to tell you something about his undergraduate experience and the beginning of the Upward Bound program at Columbia. And almost in those exact same years, just a tiny bit later, I myself was having an early Upward Bound experience. When I went home from college to Little Rock, Arkansas, there were 2 summers in which I worked as a residential counselor at a local Upward Bound project. And it was a very fascinating, very mind-blowing experience for me. And it left me with a lifelong fondness and admiration for the Upward Bound program. And over my years teaching at Columbia, I did several times, you know, every couple of years, I would email the people at Upward Bound and offer to volunteer for them. And they were always very nice. And they always said, that's so good of you, we'll get back to you. And then they never did. And finally, in retirement, I realized this is ridiculous. Even if they aren't set up to have retired faculty members as volunteers, I'm going to make them be it. I'm going to do that and dig myself a little place to be a volunteer in Upward Bound, or Double Discovery as it's called at Columbia. And so I've been working on that, but that's a whole nother story, and that isn't the story we want to tell here, because I was much more naive and hapless than Roger was in those days, and my Upward Bound experience affected mostly my own psyche. But Roger's experience became creative and transformative. And over the years, it has been so for literally thousands of high school and college students. So, Roger, let's go back to the beginning when you were an undergraduate math major, at Columbia College. Please tell us how you and a few of your friends more or less fell into running an early version of the Upward Bound program.
Okay, first thank you to Jeanne and to Volker and to Fran for having me and giving me the chance to talk with you. I would just say, Fran, we may not have worked on Upward Bound together for a long time, but in my deaning years, you were a faculty member, and I think we worked together on a number of important things in those
Lit hum.
At that time, and I have very fond memories of that. So you shouldn't forget those connections as well. But to go back, you know, Fran asked me to go back to the beginning of Columbia's program in 1965, and one thing to keep in mind is that there was no Upward Bound in 1965. The Double Discovery Center has its own name, Double Discovery, because it existed before Upward Bound did. And the truth is that Upward Bound was modeled on what we did at Columbia in 1965 because of the success that it had. Upward Bound is a national program funded at that time by the Office of Economic Opportunity, the Anti-Poverty Program, now funded through the Department of Education in Washington. That is a national program. It exists on hundreds of campuses across the country, and it's designed to have those colleges help high school students from low-income families whose parents have not been to college to have a better chance of going to college than they would have otherwise, to make up for some of the inequities that exist. And Upward Bound has existed 1 year less than Columbia's Double Discovery Center, because it was founded in 1966 based in part on what we did. Now, one way I could answer Fran's question about the beginning is to say, yes, a bunch of us undergraduates were wonderful and we did great things, and it led to this fabulous program, and we were idealistic and smart and resourceful and did all of that. But at the risk of talking for a longer time, I just want to put some context into this, because that wouldn't be a real story about how this started. One important bit of context is that this was the mid-60s. You know, I'm talking to people who,
we know.
who remember this, that the 60s was more complicated. We didn't go from the supposedly boring 50s to the late 60s of violence and turmoil and anti-war activity and distrust of authority across the board. There was a time in the mid-60s when there was genuine hope about the future of this country and the ways in which things ranging from racial justice to poverty could be overcome in some significant way. Or racial injustice could be overcome, poverty could be overcome. 1965 was a time when the federal government, whatever was going on or beginning to happen in Vietnam, when we had a Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and a federal effort to reduce the level of poverty in the United States. And for someone like me in college at that time, I was in the class of 1967 at Columbia College. And to many of the people I knew, that was a hopeful time. It was a time when we could imagine things continuing to get better. You know, and Fran, you said you were naive in certain ways. We were naive in thinking things would continue to get better, but in some straight line. But that hope gave us some energy. Without that context of hope and promise, we wouldn't have felt the way we did. As important as that is a local context of Columbia itself. And when I describe this to students today or to younger alumni, they don't believe me, but I'm going to tell the story to you and hope that you believe me. Columbia itself was a special place for students who had the kinds of ideals that my friends and I, my colleagues and I had. And I'll give a couple of examples of that. When I arrived as a freshman in 1963, I still remember the address the dean of the college gave at that time. And he obviously talked about the intellectual wonders that we would find as students at Columbia, the great core curriculum that meant so much to all of us as undergraduates and it brought many of us to Columbia. Frankly, I was there to be a math major. Core curriculum was a wonderful surprise to me. But in addition to that, the dean of the college said to all of us who were freshmen that year, whether you're from a family of privilege or whether you're poor and you're the first in your family to go to college, being at Columbia is an extraordinary privilege. And that places on you obligations. That's not a typical dean's statement, certainly wasn't at that time. And I'm not sure that it really is today. But that was something he meant very seriously. And in fact, even as part of the core curriculum, the Contemporary Civilization program at that time was seen as something that was there not just to fill our minds with stuff and to help our brains work better so we could get jobs as lawyers or doctors or professors later on. It was there to produce more effective, more responsible citizens. And the notion of our obligation to the world, our using the privileges that we had by being at Columbia to serve others who were less privileged, who didn't have that opportunity, that was an obligation we took on by being Columbia students. And that was backed up by institutional things Columbia College did that allowed those of us who were students at the time to do what we did with the Double Discovery Center. In particular, Columbia's largest single student activity was at the time something called the Citizenship Council. It was an old-fashioned name. It even later on took, had associations of racist activity in the South. But the Citizenship Council was something that a dean of the college, Lawrence Chamberlain, created in the 1950s. That was a student organization designed to help undergraduates in the college take their place as volunteers in public schools in Harlem or East Harlem, in hospitals, in community centers, even in prisons, to learn something about their privilege in the world and those who didn't have it, and to develop habits of service and citizenship. That activity was supported by the college in unique ways, not like other student activities. It had dedicated staff to support it. In fact, the dean of the college in the 50s, Lawrence Chamberlain, suggested that that kind of activity become a requirement, but the faculty told him to go back and mind his own business on that. But that context, that meant that the college was supporting students engaging in that kind of volunteer activity in a very concrete and direct way. And there were staff members designed to do that. So that activity from the 50s into the 60s became the biggest single student activity at Columbia when I was an undergraduate. More students participated in that than all the athletic teams put together, in all the publications, the theater groups, and so on. Those of us who worked in that program as volunteers, when I was a freshman, I tutored at a school in East Harlem. I tutored a first grader. I doubt I was much help to him, but I did. I learned something through that experience. Those of us who did that work felt that we were learning something important, we were doing something important, and we were also learning what possibilities there were for us in our lives. That kind of activity at Columbia with that support led to more undergraduates creating programs of that sort on their own rather than just being volunteers in other places. So in 1965, there was a significant cohort of undergraduates at Columbia, and Columbia and Barnard for that matter, Barnard students participated in this as well, who wanted to do something significant. So how did we end up with a federal grant large enough to have 160 low-income New York City high school students live on campus for 8 weeks, take classes, learn something about college, get tutoring and other kinds of support? The answer was that a particular faculty member at Columbia, some of you probably remember, James Shenton from the history department, heard from a former student of his who worked for Senator Robert Kennedy that there was this possibility of getting federal funding for an experimental program to have high school students come to college campuses and get preparation to go to college, make it more likely they would attend college. And to remind you of the context, at that time, City University of New York didn't have an open admissions program. Low-income students who went to fairly dismal New York City high schools weren't assured anything about going to college afterwards. So those of you who know Jim Shenton won't be surprised to hear that he didn't go to the dean or the provost or the president with this information. He came to those of us who were working on those programs, those kinds of programs already. And he said, if you put together a proposal that meets these guidelines, I'll make sure Columbia supports it and sends it in with the president's name on it. So naive and foolish that we were, we spent, at the expense of our academic lives, we spent some time putting together a proposal to the federal government to have 160 students live on the Columbia campus and be tutored by college students who were there, taught by high school teachers who would be hired, and taken on all kinds of activities around the city that would introduce them to college life in some significant way. We did that. Jim carried through on his promise, but to be fair, the dean of the college, that same dean I talked about who spoke to us as freshmen, didn't need to be persuaded, because he saw that this was the culmination of some of the things that he had talked about. We got that grant, we ran the program, we had people from Washington visiting us. We had to, at Columbia's urging, we pretended there were actual grown-ups in charge of the program for most of it, which they were persuaded of, fortunately. And Upward Bound came about on a national scale, in part because of our success, and we continued to be funded through Upward Bound and later other grants. So that, it isn't just that we were smart and resourceful. We were in a context that allowed this to happen, gave us the belief that something like that could happen, and were encouraged by the dean of the college and Professor Shenton that we could do this. And it happened, and it's still going on. So that's maybe a longer version of how it started, Fran, than you wanted, but there you are.
No, it's very fascinating, and I want to, in fact, dig a little deeper. Would you say that after that start, was there a kind of linear progression, and the program just went from success to success, or were there any crisis times when it might have taken a turn for the worse?
Well, there were regular difficult times in the first several years, because those became years of turmoil, racial turmoil, anti-war turmoil, and that, when there was urban unrest, uprisings, whatever term you would put on what was going on in the cities of the United States, that obviously affected our students. We were with them on that. There were things going on in New York that affected our students a great deal. And Columbia may have noticed, I'm not sure they were well organized enough to notice, but they may have noticed that some of the leaders of SDS in 1968 and some leaders of the Student Afro-American Society in 1968, who were occupying buildings, had worked at Double Discovery. And so I don't think they ever did put that together, but that could have threatened the success of the program. In the early years, though, the federal funding increased. We had more students living there. We were on a roll. A year or two after I graduated, a full-time director was hired, which was really essential to the program's success. The other thing that could have undermined the program at that time was that so many undergraduates thought that political activity was so much more important than something like this, that had the program continued to depend on undergraduate leadership, it probably would have faded away, as did the Citizenship Council that I mentioned before, the umbrella organization for volunteer activity. It's only with the existence of community impact that was created more than 10 years later, that still exists at Columbia. That's now an umbrella for service activity by students and others on the campus. That kind of activity became unfashionable. If we hadn't gotten a full-time director to oversee the program and assure its continued success, it probably would have disappeared in the early years. But the need was there, continued to exist. The difference we were making, the high school students continued to exist. The undergraduates who worked in the program saw the difference they were making. But those are some of the things from the early years that I would have worried about. I'm not sure I was smart enough to worry about them at the time. If you look at a longer time horizon, one of the things that that also would have had an effect if the program continued to rely on undergraduates is that when those of us who worked on the program in the early years, writing that proposal, writing another proposal the next year, executing the program, staying in touch with the high school students, we knew that we were helping individual high school students, that we were changing the lives of some of those young people. But because of the optimism I talked about earlier, we also believed, and we were just naive and foolish, but we believed that if these high school students came to Columbia's program, to the Double Discoveries program, and their lives were changed in that way, if we had students who were not being successful in the public high schools they attended, and yet could be successful in the context of the courses and activities that we had for them, and they got to college and were successful, even though their high school records initially didn't predict that. We believed that if those things happened, the people around the public schools would be so embarrassed they'd fix everything and the program would go away. And a lot of the energy, I mean, that was, you know, no grown-up would believe that, right? But that's what we thought we were doing. And part of it was that it was a hopeful time. And it was what gave us a lot of the energy we had. A couple of years into it, it was clear that that was not, in fact, what was going to happen. I'm not sure any of us would have expected 55 years later, the need in New York City is just as great as it was in 1965. That's a depressing fact. It's a demoralizing fact that the program is still helping individuals, but that so little has changed about the public school system and the lack of equity in it, not just in New York, but across the country. But that gave us an energy we otherwise wouldn't have had. And when it became clear that wasn't happening, that probably would have sort of taken the wind out of our sails a bit too.
Well, let's also look at the later stages of the same process. In recent years, you and your wife have done a good deal of work with programs that give college scholarships to young people of the kind who pass through the Double Discovery program, including the Lenfest Foundation and a scholarship project sponsored by the New York Times. You've said that you always emphasize to them that access is not enough. And so you've told me in remarkable detail some of the things that are necessary for these kids to succeed in college beyond just plunking them down on a campus. Could you elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, and just to clarify something Volker said at the beginning, Double Discovery Center helps only New York City students. The involvement I've had in Pennsylvania and Florida and in New York with scholarship programs is separate from that. It has nothing to do with Columbia. And what Fran is referring to is that when I first started that work about 20 years ago, helping the New York Times with a scholarship program they wanted to begin, they wanted to find needy New York City kids, give them scholarships and help them get into good colleges, and saw that as a noble thing to do, which it is. When they sought my advice about it before they started the program, the first thing I said to them was that that was not sufficient, that if they were going to find the undiscovered young people, they were going to identify people who weren't already part of important scholarship programs like the Ron Brown Scholarship and things of that sort, that they not only had to help the students get into college, but they had to work with them through college, that the money was not the only issue they had to address. That was something I learned, Fran, not just from Double Discovery, but from my experience as a dean at Columbia. Because, I mean, when I started as dean of students in 1979, one of the first things, I mean, that was a decade after the events of the late 60s. The staff of the college had been decimated. They probably only hired a young person like me because I was cheap and not too stupid. but there had been no institutional research. So one of the first things I did was have somebody on my staff try to figure out how many of our students were graduating and how that broke down by race. And what I discovered wasn't a big surprise, given the experience I had had with Columbia, but it was still, the specifics were very disappointing. Not only was Columbia's graduation rate lower than that of its Ivy League peers, but that the graduation rate for the Black and Hispanic students who were attending at that time was roughly half the graduation rate for white students. That Columbia, through its admissions office, was making an effort to identify students from racial minority groups, underrepresented groups in colleges like Columbia, and admitting them, and then it had no idea what to do. It had no idea how to provide the support those students needed. These are students who were perfectly capable of being successful at Columbia, but they were being let down in what we did. And that became one of the major projects I had in my early years as Dean of Students, which was to change that. And 4 or 5 years later, not only were there more Black and Hispanic students enrolled at Columbia College, but their graduation rate was identical to those of white students. It took focused effort of the sort that, you know, I could describe, but it really is not rocket science in a way. It requires listening to students, hearing them when they say that you're not doing things right, or here are some ways you can do them better, changing what you're doing, and holding your staff accountable for what the outcome is. Not just some single person who works with non-white students, but the whole staff responsible for those outcomes. And that's where I learned that about college in that way. And so that when I started working with scholarship programs, beginning with the New York Times program in New York, the Lenfest program for rural students in Pennsylvania, others in Florida over the years, my focus was always on, look, colleges by and large are not prepared to help these students they're admitting. They're getting better, some of them are better than others. But if you want your scholarship program to succeed, if you want the students you're giving this opportunity to find it worthwhile and meaningful, you've got to provide support through college as a scholarship program, not just rely on the colleges to do their work. And the fact is, with the New York Times Scholarship Program, which took students entirely from very low-income families in New York who'd overcome significant obstacles in their lives, they got into fabulous colleges and had a 98% graduation rate. It's higher than Columbia College's graduation rates, certainly not what the demographics would have predicted for those groups.
You've said that one of the important principles that you learned is that one must be proactive and not wait for students to ask for help, but to go to students and say, how are you doing? Is everything okay? And fix problems before they had time to get huge.
That's a big part of it, and something any college could do if it made the effort, is not to wait for students to come in and say, I'm having trouble. The advice, you have a little bit of intrusive advising, especially in the first semester, the first year, and you listen to what you hear and you provide the help and advice and direction. And if you've already earned some trust from the students because they've gone through a selection process, you can make a big difference in their overcoming the inevitable obstacles of college. With every scholarship program I've ever run, I tell the students at the beginning, look, the difference between successful college students and unsuccessful college students is the successful ones know when to ask for help and assume they're entitled to get it. That almost no one goes through college without trouble, without some kind of bump. Could be academic, it could be doubt about career, it could be family, love life, a whole range of things, financial. Lots of things get in the way of college students being successful. But, I used to say to the scholars, act like you're the grandchild of a trustee, because if that person was having trouble, that student would assume I need help. I had to adapt that because students didn't know what trustees were. So, you just had to change the message a little bit. The main point is it's not a sign of your failure if you're having trouble. And you have to overcome the notion. I mean, I saw this with the New York Times scholars especially, but with every scholarship program I've worked with. You had to get past the idea the students knew they were chosen from this enormous applicant pool. They were singled out. They had an article written about them in the Times, and their picture was in the Times. They go to these competitive colleges. It's hard to ask for help because you think, I'm going to let down the people who chose me. I'm going to let down the college that admitted me. And you've got to get past that thought that asking for help is a sign that is something that's going to embarrass you or embarrass the people who gave you the chance. And that takes work. It just takes persistence. It takes being aware that that's an issue in the first place. And I wish more colleges today acted in a way that acknowledged those issues for some of the students they're admitting. Because if you acknowledge it, listen to students, you can make a difference.
Mm-hmm. Well, we want to leave time for discussion, and so let me just ask you a sort of
on, didn't I? I probably talked longer than you wanted me
no,
to.
No, I have greatly enjoyed, just as I've enjoyed our lunches, I greatly enjoy hearing these things, and I'm sure everybody else does too, but I bet they would all like to be unmuted and ask their own questions. So let me just ask you a sort of all-purpose conclusion question. Is there anything special that you would like to leave, to be sure to say to this group? I mean, are there any thoughts that you have, or any things that we should do, or any things that we should know that are very urgent and important that you would bring us out of your experience? Because here we are, a group of your peers. We may have resources, we may have ideas and opportunities. Is there anything special that you'd like to say to us for sure?
Well, Volker said at the beginning that he thought we should try to take this to today. And to the extent that the things I've focused on in my life have to do with educational equity, I think we should all be aware of the fact that on college campuses and in public schools, what's going on with COVID-19, with the pandemic, with the economic results of that, all of those things are increasing the inequity that already exists. So many people are focusing on the fact that selective colleges this year have told their applicants, you don't have to complete standardized tests because they're hard to take, they're not available. I think the ACT was just canceled a few days ago in a lot of places. And focused on that as somehow helping with equity in admissions in higher education. The fact is, everything going on exacerbates inequity right now, and it's going to take more effort on the part of people in colleges and universities, but also all of us who have anything to say as citizens about education. We've got to recognize that that this isn't going to get better without some focused effort and really and real resources going into having that happen. So that's not an uplifting thought, but it is, I think that it's the thing I'm spending a lot of my time on right now and trying to help my students understand.
Thank you so much, Roger. This is a lovely example of the very rich activities and interests that you've had throughout your life, and it's a privilege to hear you describe them. And let me turn it over to Volker, because he's going to let people ask questions and have a sort of discussion of some of the things that they might want to know.
Yes, well, thank you again, Roger, and also Fran. I think we have lots of things to talk about now, and I'm glad that you also looked at. If I may start at your beginning again, what I think is also member of the mid-60s is that there was a plan in Washington headed by Lyndon Johnson of building a great society, a project which I think would actually have made available the resources also. And the only thing that survived from this, this Great Society program is Medicare, actually, as far as I know, because it was very ambitious and was also targeting education and mobility in education. So I'm glad that we started off, but I think we should now open the floor for questions. My only question is, request is that you don't ask long questions, because I'm sure that there are quite a few of you who would like to chip in. So anyone who would like to join? Joanne? Is there someone, I think you've got to unmute. You have to indicate that you would like to join. Yes, Jeanne?
Roger, what was the, one of the different, I was a CCNY student, and we were at about the same time. We were, none of us had any money, but we had vision, and we were being pushed, and there were, the cultural deprivations were ones that we could overcome. But what happened to the kids, and how do you handle the huge cultural gaps that people have when you come from an impoverished background and get put into Columbia University? I remember the first time I went to Low Library, and I said, oh, well, this must be what money actually is, to see those pictures. And how did you deal with that huge cultural gap?
Well, first, it's in some ways, it's not a single thing. So I can take pieces of it. One of the problems that those high school students faced is not thinking of themselves as college students on a college campus. And the fact that their parents hadn't been to college, and the fact their parents may have been telling them, we don't have the money to go to college, so don't think about that. Having them live on the campus with current undergraduates who, that experience by itself, I think, had an effect on how they saw themselves and what was possible for them. It didn't mean they were going to go to Columbia or Barnard, but it allowed them to talk to current college students at Columbia and Barnard about what it was like to be there. And some of those students themselves were the first to go to college. Some of them were students who had come from very limited financial circumstances. That's a part of it. Another part of it is to help them be successful academically, so that, in fact, their real chances of success in college would be better. And that experience of academic success is a non-trivial thing. By definition, the students we were bringing into Double Discovery at the time, and that's continued to be the case to now, students who are already successful in high school are not eligible to go to Double Discovery, because that it'd be harder to provide that kind of increment. So that academic success alone is part of it. But there are a range of things to try to help the students see themselves in a more hopeful way. Now, that was different 55 years ago, because as I mentioned, City University wasn't even an open admissions place then. There was no fallback for any high school graduate to automatically go to college. So we saw ourselves as trying to get them more prepared academically, having better grades, having a better chance of getting in, getting financial aid if they were going to a private college. Sometimes it involves working with their parents, and there have always been parent programs as part of it, of double discovery. They're not as significant in time or financial resources as what we do with the students, but it's important for the families of the young people in the program to believe these things are possible as well. Those are the real issues. The parents of double discovery students love their kids as much as we love our children. They don't necessarily have the knowledge to provide them about how to get to college. They sometimes think that their financial circumstances will prevent their children from going to college, and we can talk to them about financial aid and so on. But it isn't that you're starting from a place of indifference on the part of the parents. You're starting from a place of fewer resources in knowledge and finances to help their children. So there's more you can do, I think, than you think.
Any other questions?
Am I unmuted?
Yes, Carolyn, please. Carolyn Friedman. Oh, sorry. Could we have Margaret first, because I think you are already unmuted.
Yes.
Okay, and then Carolyn.
Okay. You may have just answered this, but I'm going to ask it again anyway. What do the parents of students who are in the Columbia Upward Bound program know about the program about what's happening to their students? And what kind of contact do people in the Upward Bound program have with the families of the students who are in that program?
I probably should let I think there was somebody from Double Discovery on the call. I probably should let that person answer the question about what's going on now. Is she still here?
She's no longer here, unfortunately.
Well, then I'll do the best I can to explain it as someone observing now rather than being a part of it directly, which is that everybody recognizes that the families are an important part of the support the students need. And there are two things that Double Discovery does now that address that question. One is simply knowledge, keeping the parents informed. I mean, just you know, when for a student to get into Double Discovery, the parents have to fill out forms of their own, because you have to have certified financial information to prove the student's eligible, because someone with a high enough income wouldn't be eligible, and so on. So the parents have to cooperate at the beginning, at least to that degree. But some of it is knowledge, and some of it is support. So what the program has put in place the last several years, not with federal funding, because the federal funding won't pay for it, but with privately raised money, there is now a set of social work counselors on the staff to work with families about some of the issues they face, some of which involve housing stability or employment, healthcare, and mental health issues, so that we can remove any obstacles possible to the student being successful. Obviously, you can't solve every one of those problems, but with private funding, because the federal funding won't allow it, there are additional resources now available to the families.
Thank you.
Thank you. Carolyn, you raised your hand. Very good.
I wondered how the name came about, Double Discovery, and what it means. I can understand Upward Bound, but what about Double Discovery?
That's my failure that should have been my starting point. The Double Discovery name came from the fact that we as college students at the time recognized that we would learn as much from this experience as the high school students did. Wouldn't be the same things, but
Okay.
that this would be a really meaningful, important, and long-lasting part of our education. Not in the credit for, earning credits toward a degree sense. And double discovery was bluntly an acknowledgement of the fact that there were going to be benefits coming to the college students from participating in this. And that has lasted to today. One of the ways that, even though now there's a full-time director, a full-time staff, as there are at Upward Bound and similar programs around the country, one of the things that distinguishes Columbia's program from the others is that there are still dozens of undergraduate volunteers every year who help the high school students to supplement what the paid staff is doing, so that double discovery aspect is still there. And the program can accomplish more with the students it works with, the high school students it works with, because of the free labor, frankly, the volunteer efforts of the college students who do help to SAT prep, even to the point of helping students craft their college essays and fill out financial aid applications. Without that additional help, the staff would be able to do less than it could now. And in fact, in the class in American Studies that Volker referred to, Equity and Access in American Higher Education, I've taught for a dozen years now, any student in that seminar to pass the course has to spend 4 hours a week at Double Discovery, engaging in one of those activities and learning not just about equity and access as academic subjects, but to see firsthand what the experience of those students has been. Now, by the nature of Barnard and Columbia undergraduates, half of the students in my seminar in a typical year are getting need-based financial aid, and some of them are getting significant financial aid, and they've had lives like the double discovery students, and they learn a little less on that side of things. But the fact is, half the students at Columbia and Barnard don't get need-based financial aid, not because the colleges ran out of money, but because they don't need it. And today, to be ineligible for need-based financial aid at a place like Barnard or Columbia, your family has to be in the top 2% in income in the country. So 50% of our students are from roughly the top 2% in income in the country. They've never filled out a financial aid application. They have no idea the difficulties that the students we work with in Double Discovery face every day, or the students in other cities face every day. They have no idea. They've gone to high schools that have given them the kind of support they take for granted. And it's a big shock to them to realize that the privilege they've had is not just having more money, but having support in their schools of the sort that they took for granted and is available to very, very few students. There's something you may have heard referred to called imposter syndrome, which many students face when they get to college. It's not limited to low-income first-generation students or to students who are from underrepresented groups on college campuses. But what it is you get there and you think, they must have made a mistake. I don't really belong here. I'm not really up to this. These other students have had so much help, and they already have studied the classics in their high school courses, or they've had better math courses in high school. How am I going to be a pre-med? All of these things that can depress the optimism or hope of some of those students when they come to a place like Barnard or Columbia. In the middle of my course, the more typical thing is the students who are in fact from wealthier families, who are not getting financial aid, between the work at Double Discovery and the things we read in the course, they're the ones who come to office hours and think, did I really deserve to get into Columbia? You know, I had so much help, I didn't understand the difference in resources available to me. And that's a little beyond Double Discovery, but it's the same kind of thing. It's learning more clearly, and not just through academic work, but through experience, what one's place in the world has been and what others' lives are like. So that's probably too long a version, but that's where the name came from, and I think it still lives up to that.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Is there another question?
Yeah, I would
Yes,
like,
please.
like to
Steve.
say two
Oh, sorry.
I'd like to say two things, neither of which is emotionally uplifting. I'm sure that everybody here knows that urban public schools in the United States have become resegregated. They are as segregated as schools were after the Civil War and after the Reconstruction period. And that's a social issue we've got to do something about. The second thing, Volker, there's another one of Lyndon Johnson's programs which is still alive, and it's called Title I. It's an educational program in schools that provides extra tutoring instruction for students from low-income families who need help. And that program has been in operation for years and years. And unfortunately, in spite of the fact that there have been all sorts of efforts to improve it, and it's always been evaluated, and there are reams of data on who learns and who doesn't learn, that program has not solved the problem of lower achievement among lower income students.
Thank you. I would like to ask Roger whether you have a comment on this, but then Steve, I think, should also come in. So Roger, if you have a response to the Title I problem, which I'm sure you have deeply been involved with.
Yeah, but I think it was described quite clearly, so I'm not going to add anything to that.
Okay. Well, Steve Stellman, in that case, would you like to come in?
Sure. Yeah, something that you said towards the end of your talk about the changing the the admissions requirements, particularly my department, epidemiology. The doctoral admissions committee has decided this year not to consider graduate record exams anymore. And in fact, they're making it optional for students to submit. So that introduces already an interesting set of choices. I wonder how you feel. This can't be a new thing though, considering balancing admissions.
Well, on the undergraduate level, there have been colleges shifting to being test optional, meaning that they don't require SAT scores for admission. And many of them have said they're doing that in the interest of equity and providing opportunities to students who don't have the resources to get help in preparing for those tests. You know, well, I'll skip my cynical comments about we could get back to that if you want. I think there are other motivations for some colleges to do that. But this year, where so many colleges doing it, some of the most selective colleges in the country are test optional because of the circumstances that it's unrealistic to require students to be admitted. But think of the things that they have to look at in admissions when they're making a decision at the undergraduate level. They have a high school transcript. They have test scores in a typical year. They have what the student writes. They have what the teachers write and the guidance counselor writes. They have, you know, the students filling out forms about extracurricular activities and so on. Now, you take those one by one, leave out the testing, which certainly is overall unfair to low-income students in the sense that they don't have the same ability to prepare for that. They don't have the same resources to prepare for those tests that better off students do. But take the other things. With the transcript, I'm not sure how your department would look at it with different colleges, but I bet that just as colleges do with high schools, you're inevitably going to think better of a certain transcript from Stanford than you would from a community college in Chicago.
It's hard to escape. I mean,
Right.
you got the transcripts, so you know where they went.
So that, that's already going to work against many students, many of the same students who are disadvantaged by standardized testing. If you look at the narrative parts of applications, what the student writes and what the teachers write, in the scholarship programs, I've seen recommendations from public schools in different parts of the country. And I've seen recommendations from Horace Mann, from Trinity School, from Andover and Exeter, from Harvard Westlake School, private schools that are expensive and have primarily high-income students attending them. And it's incredibly difficult for an admissions officer to take account of the fact that the high school recommendations from public schools are so much less good than the ones from the private schools. And they're less good in a variety of ways. The people writing them don't have as much time because their classes are larger. But even more than that, they don't know who their audience is. The public school teachers are very unlike, except at some of the most prestigious high schools or suburban high schools, typical New York City high school. The teachers don't really know who the audience is, and they don't, even if they care about the student and think highly of the student, crafting a good recommendation is very difficult, especially when you've never met an admissions officer or you haven't gotten coaching from your own high school about how to do it. I'm telling you, putting those recommendations next to each other, relying on them rather than standardized testing is not going to right the balance of equity one bit. In fact, yesterday, I spent time in a Zoom call trying to help teachers at a public school in Florida learn how to do better by their students. It's not, these are teachers who care about their students. They do their best to teach them well, but the letters they send are abysmal because I see them for the scholarship program there. We've got to help them to do a better job for students, but that's a little patch in one high school. I'm doing another one in a week at a different high school in Florida. That's a patch. It's not going to change the fact that if you're relying on those written documents, it's always going to favor the privileged as well. And if you get to what the students write, students at Horace Mann and at Trinity and at Exeter and Harvard Westlake and the places like them get an incredible amount of help from their schools about how to shape those essays to be effective in their college applications. Because the people advising those students know who's behind the curtain. They know what admissions officers want to read, what will impress them, what will not impress them, what will turn them off. And so those students are writing fabulous essays. The students in our scholarship programs, we give them that kind of help that they'd get at a private school. They come out with essays that do them justice and that understand the nature of the person making the decision on the other side of the curtain. But most public school students are not getting that kind of help. So all of those things are still going to work against an equitable admission system. I hope you're more successful this year with that, but I assume you see the same kinds of things.
Well, and sometimes we see the opposite. Sometimes the students will get a recommendation from somebody who's the super chair of a super department, and you can tell that it's a pro forma thing because that guy doesn't have the time to write a really serious one. So a lot of the recommendation letters are kind of, you sort of learn which ones really are serious. But it's really the evaluation tools that are left over after you take out the quantitative tests. But also, in discussions in our doctoral admissions committee, frequently somebody will note that somebody started college at a pretty low-level community college and transferred to a really good school and did well there. And that's sort of quite a lot in their favor.
And admissions people try to make judgments like that. Admissions people are not, a lot of them are very young and idealistic. They want to do the right thing. They try to take those things into account. But I can tell you, reading the written material from students and teachers at a private school and from the students and teachers at a public school by and large, you just want to cry because of the disparity. But using that kind of judgment, and one of the things you describe letters from people who are very important, and the pro forma could mean they don't know the student, or it could be, I've seen this myself on graduate work level, the person writing thinks, you know who I am, and if I say this person's good, you don't need any corroborative detail. There's nobody in high school who has that sense of self-importance. So that never happens.
Well, I'm of course watching the time, but I hope you feel that we shouldn't end this conversation now. In fact, I'm wondering, is there anyone else who would like to ask a question? Daniel, yes, please. Please unmute.
Yes, thank you very much. I gather that the focus of the Upward Bound and Double Discovery programs are on students fairly late in their high school career. Would there be any benefit in trying to start earlier in the high school career and groom these students more gradually over a few years rather than towards the end of the high school?
Well, the first year of Double Discovery, we had only 9th graders. And then we had them continue with the program through. And that was certainly better to do than looking to 11th and 12th graders, because you can make a bigger difference if you start earlier. Right now, it's more dependent on who applies and when, and it's, I don't think there's as even a spread of students among the 4 grades of high school. But there's no question that earlier is better. In fact, for some years, Double Discovery has made an effort to have a middle school program, so it could work with 7th and 8th graders as well, because the earlier you start, the more of a difference you can make. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Jeanne, please come in.
Roger, is there any help for people to have places to study? And, lots of times people are living in very small apartments with minimal Wi-Fi and everything else. Is there study space? Is there room?
Well, there are 2 ways to answer that question. One is about today, and the answer for today is there really are very few options because even public libraries have been closed. But in ordinary times, in fact, the fact that the students can come to the Double Discovery Center after school and do their homework there and study there and get help there, it gives them a more quiet place, a more valuable place to study when sometimes things at home are more crowded and there are more demands on that young person. And for some of the Double Discovery students, it's also that it gives them a place where it's acceptable to be a little nerdy and care about your homework and do that instead of playing a game or hanging out and doing something more social. It gives the students permission to be in that setting without embarrassment because everybody around them is the same. Many students talk about the value of the setting itself. Unfortunately, that's not present now.
Any other questions? Actually, I have got one, Roger, if I may ask you, and that is perhaps a bit political now and more wide-ranging. You emphasized 1965 as the moment. Are we again at a 1965 moment right now? Because it seems to me the issues that you were concerned with as an idealistic young Columbia student are still very much part of the public debate, except that the debate is so polarized at the moment. Was that the case in 1965? Or is it now so difficult to establish any connection, because it seems to me this anti-intellectualism that Hofstadter wrote about in our time actually seems to have strengthened again and poses obstacles to the kind of work that you are so desperately trying to promote and have been doing for so many years.
In 1965, I think the political difference was that there was more of a consensus at the government level that there were serious issues that needed to be addressed in racial terms and in economic terms, and could argue about how sincere that was, or how effective it was, or how well thought out it was, but since then, there's been no comparable commitment at the national level. That said, I think what we're seeing now politically is not something new. I mean, some of you know much more about this than I would. I think it's more visible. When I think one reason I was a little less surprised in 2016 than some of my friends is that I had spent many years before that in rural Pennsylvania working on a scholarship program. When I started working there, I mean, I almost didn't work for that program. I told Jerry Lenfest when he asked for my help, I'm a city boy. I don't know anything about rural life. You have the wrong guy. And fortunately, he was a very persuasive person who didn't take no for an answer easily. But when I started working there, somebody said, you don't know Pennsylvania. It's Philadelphia and Pittsburgh with Alabama in between. And I thought it just didn't make sense to me. But those outlooks have been here the whole time. I mean, the young people I've found there give me hope about the future. But the adults in those communities might as well be living in Alabama for their typical political views. And they now have an ability to speak out and be less embarrassed. In 1965, it may have looked one way at Columbia, but it didn't look that way at the University of Mississippi. It didn't look that way at Duke. It didn't look that way at campuses in the Southeast, certainly, and I would bet at a number of other campuses. What seems similar is that more of us who are white now are at least aware of what we didn't know about the experience of people who are Black, in particular, right this year. That it's just very easy to see those things in intellectual terms alone, or in group and social terms alone, rather than understanding or trying to understand better what the actual experience of particular human beings has been. And that's why I focus on what college students learn by this experience that changes them in some significant way. But that is not automatically going to lead to anything very positive any more than it did in 1965. But as I say, with the politics, I almost hesitate to answer that with Frank Wolf here in the group. He knows more about the political history, certainly, than I do.
I wonder what you think about the program that there was an emphasis in the Obama administration and an emphasis on making community colleges available for everyone, and whether this doesn't also make a good deal of sense. And I know when I sit on admissions, if I see a student who's gone from community to Penn, then I am done very well there, then that student goes to the top of my list. But I mean, I just wonder, I wonder what the right connections are, especially since I think the point of starting so late is so important. We need to be back at the Head Start level and starting them at age 3 and moving up. So what's the realm of the possible?
Well, two things. One is your question about Obama's emphasis on community colleges. I think was the only sensible approach for him to take. If you think about the most selective colleges in the country, whatever they do in the way of providing more opportunity in admissions, it will be a minuscule change in the national picture. And if you look at the disparities in college attendance for low-income students versus high-income students, Black and Latino students versus white students, the only way you're going to move the needle in a meaningful way in national terms is in public colleges. And probably the most significant change you can make in how many people are getting some college education, some level of a college degree, is with community colleges. I think he was exactly right about that. I'm glad he didn't take all the research money away from places like Columbia, but he may not even have gone far enough in shifting resources in that direction. And then the second part of your question is about what's realistic, and it's always, as I said before, it's always better to start earlier. But one of the things that's been clear from the last 5 decades with Upward Bound and double discovery and programs like it is that you still can make a difference with some high school students and change their lives and give them opportunities that they wouldn't have had otherwise. And that's worth doing. I'm not in a position to say, to decide how much money is going to go to Upward Bound versus Head Start. So I'm not faced with a real decision about that. But it's clear that you can save the lives of high school kids, even though it's later than Head Start.
Well, on that note, I'm actually wondering, we've been going on for an hour and a half, actually, unless there is perhaps one last question.
There is one more question coming from Ruby Sani. She unmuted herself and she can ask the question.
Okay, well, let's have her.
Oh.
You're muted, Ruby.
Can you unmute her?
I can't. The question was, can EPI contribute to their advisors writing letters for high school students?
Oh. Well, Roger?
I guess it's maybe we want to end with just
That's
a
not a question.
general, maybe we want to just end with a general question, because I know that Fran, you would describe the travails of trying to do something, trying to get into the program and passing all her necessary clearances, because she's so notorious. But I think, I guess part of a general question is, what do you think people can do? I mean, this is also, especially when we're home all the time, it seems so overwhelming. It seems like the world is coming to an end. What can people help in some sort of way, especially as academics?
Roger, I was wondering.
Well, I thought that was a question for Fran.
Well,
you address Fran. I'm not trying to evade this. I just thought you addressed Fran at the beginning.
No, we can know Fran spent a year trying to be able to tutor in double discovery. It was a a challenge.
Partly there's a delay sometimes in proving that you're not a sexual harasser. Because if you're dealing with minor students, it's assumed that you have to be vetted by the community affairs part of Columbia and the human resources, and potentially have your record examined to see if you've ever been arrested. You know, I mean, and take a training thing about the nature of sexual harassment for minors. And there's a lot of that sort of thing that you have to go through. There are other things too, because the nature of our double discovery program, as Roger pointed out, it's been powered by a tremendous force of undergraduate volunteers who are still there and are still making their double discoveries. But volunteers have been there and paid staff have been there. And there has never been, as far as I'm aware, people like us there. And so I'm determined to make a little niche for people like us. And, you know, hopefully I will be able to report eventually and suggest things that more people in this group could do. But right now, because of the disruptions partly of the whole COVID situation, it's not a good time for more people to start trying to do it at the moment. But there's that, and there's other programs too. There are programs for elementary students too, that I have looked into, that people can go and read. Of course, you used to go and read books with kids individually and pay attention to them, but now I imagine it can be done by Zoom. I haven't looked into that lately.
Well, thank you, Fran. So let's put that on the agenda, perhaps when we can meet again in person. But let me finish by, first of all, thanking you, Fran, for this contribution and your other contributions, but above all, to Roger. I think I have come away from this meeting with lots of thoughts. I have, of course, also children and grandchildren, and have been confronted very directly in my family with problems of minority also, and the whole problems that we face in this society of creating better upward mobility, which is still the great problem, not just for people like us, like me, but also for minorities. And I'm glad that was my question, that it's much more on the agenda again than it ever was, it seems to me. It is diversity. The University, Columbia, is now committed officially to this. So let's hope that there will be some results coming out of this, but it requires resources. And the question is always whether these resources will become available. So thank you very much. I raise my glass again to all of you. Good health.
Thank you, Roger.
And we will meet again either on Zoom or perhaps in person sometime in the coming year. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you.